Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike, and John, the Apostle, is now picking up the pace, now that events are beginning to happen towards Jesus' execution and resurrection. Last week, we read about Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, an arrest for which 1,000 armed men were deployed, all of whom Jesus cast to the ground by his simple announcement of his name, I am. And Jesus walked away willingly with his captors into the night. Everyone thinks they're in charge of events. Judas, the Pharisees, the Roman soldiers, the chief priests had finally got their man in custody. They'd long wanted him dead and no longer able to threaten their power and privilege. But this had all been planned in advance by a loving Creator God to redeem mankind. Under Roman rule, the Jews were not allowed to execute a sentence of death on anyone. They needed the procurator's permission to do that. Capital punishment had to be a Roman decision. That presented a problem, but not an insuperable one. So let's read from chapter 18 of John's Gospel. I'm going to start at verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, then why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You're not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So, verse 15, John talks about another disciple, and that other disciple in verse 15 is undoubtedly John himself, who narrates this account. And John, as we've seen throughout his gospel, he was in the habit of referring to himself in the third person. So John followed Jesus from the point of his arrest to Annas's palace. Annas, remember, was not the high priest, but was the godfather figure of the dynasty which effectively ran Judea for the Romans. John has already let us know that he's familiar with the ruling family. He knew the name of the temple officer Malchus, whose ear Peter cut off, and he knew the woman who's the doorkeeper at Annas's palace. She clearly knows him because of what she says later. And she knows that John is a follower of Jesus and lets him in with Jesus. Peter's left outside, and John knows that Peter is keen to learn what's going to happen to Jesus. So he goes to the woman at the door and has a word, and the woman allows Peter in. And as she lets him in, she says, in the New King James, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" A bit more closely to the Greek, she just says, "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" Like John, because he's obviously a friend of John. And Peter seems to bark back at this woman, "I am not," probably without thinking about it. And that's the first of Peter's 3 denials. So Peter then melts into a small group of men who are warming themselves by the fire on this cold night. He hopes safely anonymous by the fire. And I think we mustn't be too hard on Peter. I think we all have an instinctive reluctance to get involved closely with someone who is clearly in an awful lot of trouble, especially when the authorities have a reputation for being violent and indiscriminate. There's always the chance that we'll get arrested too in the melee. So, what was the criminal justice system like in Judea at the time? Well, the Judean criminal justice system is laid down in the Talmud. It was subject to Roman law only in respect of the death penalty. But very largely, the Roman Empire's method of administering the territories they conquered was to subdue and reward the ruling class and support them to continue to maintain social order amongst the population. Any hint of a rebellion was brutally crushed, and in return for the taxes they paid to Rome, Judean citizens would enjoy the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So I have a special interest in the principles and practice of criminal law, so please humour me for a few minutes. How we investigate crime, how we treat those who are suspected of committing a crime, and how we arrive at a decision of guilt or innocence, I think speaks volumes about who we are as a society. In the UK, we're very proud of our constitutional commitment to the rule of law, to the independence of the judiciary, to the accused person's rights to legal representation, and the right of appeal, habeas corpus, etc., even if there are occasional miscarriages of justice when parts of the system become corrupted. And there are even some populists who would seek to erode these and other basic human rights. And by doing so, they would make us more like China or Russia or Iran, for instance. And I'm glad to say that the Judean judicial system, if we can call it that, was surprisingly fair for AD 33. It provided some protections for those accused of a crime, and at least had the elements of a fair judicial process. A suspect, for instance, had to be accused by at least 2 credible witnesses, and the testimony of those witnesses had to agree in every detail. The accused was permitted to know what the charges were and to employ counsel in his or her defense. The accused could not be required to testify against himself, and the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, had a duty to protect the accused. No circumstantial evidence or hearsay was admissible, and there was a presumption of innocence. Witnesses for the defense were always called first, and trials and arrests could only take place during daylight hours and in public. And all arrests required a warrant. And this thing about daylight is very important, and it's still very important in judicial systems around the world. The daylight is always symbolic of truth. And I remember being given a tour of the Crown Court in Durham when I was a student. And we were first shown around the cells in the dark and dingy basement where the accused were held pre-trial. And then we were led up the dark, winding staircase and into the blinding sunlight of the open court. It's the only time I've ever stood in the dock, honestly. Another thing about the Judean judicial system was that any guilty verdict had to be carried out on the following day, and never on the eve of the Sabbath or a feast day. And there were no juries, by the way, in AD 33, nor are there juries in the Israeli justice system today. Unfortunately, the ruling Sanhedrin did not adhere to the principles laid down in the Talmud in the trial of Jesus. The ruling class had too much to lose to have left the outcome to be decided by a fair process. Jesus' acquittal was not something that they were prepared to allow. And in fact, I read that in 2013, so it's only 10 years ago, there was a senior but I think rather misguided Kenyan lawyer filed a petition at the International Court of Justice in The Hague to declare a mistrial in the case of Jesus. He attempted to sue the Italian government, the State of Israel, the Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, King Herod, and a whole bunch of Jewish priests, claiming that they erred in law at the original trial, thereby rendering the verdict unsafe. The ICJ, of course, dismissed the petition. They said that they had no jurisdiction in such matters. So back to the text. It's nighttime, and Jesus has been taken bound to appear before Annas. And it says, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Well, this isn't even the high priest. Annas was not the high priest. He hadn't been since AD 16. So Jesus' trial began in darkness, and it began dishonestly. Annas was the real power behind the ruling elite. And he begins by asking Jesus to identify his disciples and lay out his doctrine, hoping that he would condemn himself and his disciples by his own words, contrary to what the Talmud says. Well, Jesus knows his rights. It says, Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. So, Jesus is basically saying, what's the charge? Where are your witnesses? Jesus is inviting Annas to produce witnesses who will testify to any wrongdoing. Jesus has spoken openly. And when Jesus says, in secret, I have said nothing, I can't help thinking that this was a dig at the Pharisees who had for a long time plotted secretly to kill him while hiding hiding their murderous intent. The ruling class, of course, has no legal case. All they have is a hatred and a fierce determination to permanently remove the existential threat of Jesus. And Jesus receives a hard slap in the face for disrespect. And he asks the simple question, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? But there's no response. Annas has no response. He has no charge. He has no witnesses for the prosecution. Jesus has exposed their charade for what it is. And Annas sends Jesus away, still in chains, to his son-in-law Caiaphas. Meanwhile, Peter is warming himself at the nearby fire, and someone else asks, aren't you also one of Jesus' disciples? And Peter again says, I am not. He didn't want to be associated either with Jesus or with John, who had got him entry to the palace. Then someone who'd actually been there at Jesus' arrest recognizes Peter as the very man who had cut off his cousin's ear. And Peter, for a third time, just as Jesus had predicted, denies being a follower of Jesus. And Matthew adds that Peter swore and cursed as he made this response. And those of us with young children will be familiar with the phenomenon that the truth is usually very simply expressed, whilst the denial is always hedged around and buttressed in a futile attempt at camouflage. Hamlet's mother remarked, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. And immediately a rooster crowed, just as Jesus had told Peter a few hours earlier. Who's in control of these proceedings? Not Peter, not the temple guards, not Annas, not the ruling elite. The Lord God Almighty is conducting events towards the pivotal event in the whole of human history. In a short time now, the sinless, incarnate Son of God will become sin for us all, and in a single act of supreme love will die on the cross, so that all who believe in him can have eternal life. Amen.